All right. So welcome to New York City Stoics. This is a special edition, the first we've done. We usually have done like kind of close book reads. And over the course of this year, we've been exploring different alternatives to Stoicism in order to give people a broader overview of the kinds of ancient philosophies that competed with Stoicism. Back in the ancient times, Stoicism and Epicureanism kind of yelled at each other a lot because they both thought that they were the philosophy that hit human nature the best. But I personally don't believe that. And I personally believe that the world would be a better place if there were more thoughtful philosophers of a whole bunch of different stripes, and that includes Epicureanism. So I am happy to welcome the author and founder of the Society for the Friends of Epicurus, Hiram Crespo, as well as his friends Alan and Marcus, who are here to do some Q&A around their book. Today, we're not going to go into the basics of Epicureanism. It's presumed that you know the basics and hopefully that you've read Tending the Epicurean Garden as well. Here, we're just trying to get a chance to see how modern Epicureanism manifests itself in the world and to get some practical tips for those of you who are interested in comparing and contrasting Epicureanism with Stoicism or clarifying how Epicureanism can be applied in the modern world. So that's our goal for today. We'll be going about an hour, maybe a little over if the Epicureans are cool with that. And otherwise, I'm going to start by just welcoming you three and starting with the first question, which any of you can take in any order you want. So my first question to you involves part of what I said in the introduction, that the ancient Epicureans seem to have made arguments for nature, saying that Epicureanism was the best fit for human nature, and it also took into account how the world was, physics, physis, or nature itself. And the Stoics did the same thing. This was a common theme in ancient philosophy. And so I personally am not sure if I buy the one true philosophy thesis, because I don't think that desires and how one actually wants to craft their lives is a rational thing. I think it's irrational. There's no firm foundation for it. So I'm curious what your take is on people who are looking for a philosophy of life and how Epicurean fits into that. Do you think Epicureanism is a one size fits all humanity philosophy, or do you believe that there's different strokes for different strokes? And if so, why? So I'll turn it over to anybody who wants to answer.
So I'm not, first of all, thank you for having me. This is like the first time that I know of that there's some kind of ecumenical gathering of Stoics and Epicureans in the modern world. So it's cool to have this. So I think I share your perspective. One thing that I've seen over the years is that many people turn to Stoicism when they're going through difficulties, and when they're going through happy times, they turn to Epicurean philosophy. And so they use it in different circumstances. And then there's other philosophies that have different technologies of the soul that are used for other circumstances, or for achievement and so on. So I favor maybe a utilitarian approach to that, but obviously I'm very rooted in my Epicurean tradition and identity, because I feel like that's something that really strongly resonates with me. But I can see why other people, especially in certain, going through certain difficulties, they may find some technologies of the soul from some other lineage useful. So I favor that pragmatic approach. And in fact, in one of our ACAS recently, Alan argued that based on just stuff that we've studied from our own tradition, that the technologies of the soul that you use should be specific to the person that needs those technologies of the soul. So as far as that, I think that's just the nature of Hellenistic philosophy, that it is therapeutic, and that we should choose technologies of the soul that are useful for the particular existential questions that we're dealing with. So it's not just, actually Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita also says that people worship according to their nature. So this is a long string of ideas that goes back to antiquity, what you're saying. So it's part of it is nature, part of it is culture, and part of it is just in different circumstances, you need different technologies of the soul.
Thanks, Hiram. Alan or Marcus, do you have anything to add to that?
I might. Now, I want to apologize in advance. First of all, second Hiram, and thank you for having us here. But And I'm apologizing in advance because my connection is pretty bad right now. So if I get cut off, you know why. I'm not running away from the Stoics. But I'll say this. I think we probably might all have our own personal takes on answering this question, but I personally would borrow from the academic skeptics in saying that, you can claim that, happiness can be based on human nature or not, or a mixture of both, as Hiram is proposing. I personally go by what I find the most convincing. So it just so happens that the Epicureanism is more convincing for me. Those are the arguments that that appeal to me. Now, other people may think differently. And I think this, to a certain degree, is not inconsistent with ancient Epicureanism. The Epicureans didn't expect everyone to convert to Epicureanism. In fact, very explicitly, they're very skeptical that that everyone is going to be convinced by their arguments. In fact, there was even a treatise by one of the early Epicureans where he concludes his treatise in saying that, oh, if you're not convinced by your arguments, then I wish you the best. But if you are convinced, then I encourage you to put our teachings into practice. They're very pragmatic. Like, for example, in general, the Epicureans preferred not to get involved in politics, but there were many Epicureans who did. And the Epicurean teachers had advice for people who chose to go down that path, even though that wasn't the preferred path. But they recognized reality for what it was and people for who they were. And they made recommendations for people at where they were in their path to wisdom. I think the Stoics had a similar approach. So that's how I would answer that.
Cool. Thanks, Marcus. Alan, do you have anything to add? And no is a perfectly acceptable answer.
Well, I could just say that in our textual sources and in some of the texts of people who have commented on the development of Western philosophy, there has been this idea that that Epicureanism is a philosophy that appeals to the masses. It's non-elitist. And so it can become very popular. I'm thinking particularly of Denis Diderot, who was an 18th century French philosopher who thought that, that everybody could be considered Epicurean to some degree, but that to go into Stoicism requires a little bit more of a philosophical disposition, whereas Epicureanism seems to be more readily understandable by a lot of people. So that's what I could say.
Cool. Thank you, Alan. So I guess let's move on to my second question before opening things to the audience, second of three. So if people were interested in learning about Epicureanism and actually practicing it, the go-to source, as far as I know, is the Society for the Friends of Epicurus. And that was described in Tending the Epicurean Garden, but that was published a little while ago. So I'm curious, first of all, if you can give an overview of where people are interested in Epicureanism to practice and actually live as a philosophy of life, where can they go? And also, what's the structure of the Society for the Friends of Epicurus nowadays, and have things changed over the years? And if so, what? Again, I'll open it to anybody who'd like to talk about that.
So, well, obviously we have the Society of Epicurus.com website, and we also have a Society of Epicurus website in Spanish, because we have 2 members in Spain, and we used to have a member in Venezuela. He died 2 years ago. He was a professor. So we have a Spanish and English website, and so that you can learn. And we have a forum, we have a YouTube channel, YouTube group, Garden of Epicurus YouTube group. That's our group. There are other groups out there. There's a huge movement in Greece. I believe there's 2 or maybe 3 gardens that are organized in different cities, in Thessaloniki and Athens, and in one of the islands. I think there's another group that's forming in Greece. They've had annual gatherings for I think 14 years now in Athens in February in celebration of the birthday of Epicurus. But as far as like so Epicurus says practice meleta both by yourself and with others of like mind when he closes the letter to Menicius. So we don't form groups. We typically form little cliques because we're a philosophy of friendship, right? So it's usually just a little pot or a little clique of small circle of friends. And for us, what I'm noticing is that it's who you gather with on the 20th, which is the monthly feast that we have. We've developed a tradition of virtual feasts. So so that's kind of your Epicurean tribe when you join a group. There's a group with the Epicurean Friends Forum that's separate. They have their own approach, and they're very true to Norman Dewitt, who was a scholar from, I think, the 1800s. He was Canadian. So they're very influenced by that, and they have their own approach, and we have our own approach in Society of Epicurus. So depending on what you resonate with, then there's 2 English language groups, and there's also a meetup group in Australia that meetups physically in Sydney. There's a meetup group. I think they meet. They have an average of about a dozen people that meet every month, and then there's like people that come and go in their group. So so those are the groups available in English. So if you want to insert yourself into an Epicurean community, the main thing to do is to participate in these forums and to participate in ACAS, which is the monthly feast that we have, which is to us in the Society of Epicurus, the ACAS is just a 2-hour program. This started with the Will of Epicurus, where he was celebrating ACAS originally in memory of his friend Metrodorus, and then after he died, then what we do is we do a toast in memory of Epicurus and Metrodorus, and then we have about an hour-long lecture and just informal discussion after that, and the program usually lasts about 2 hours total. So that's the best way to really insert yourself into community, and the benefit of that is that when we become a steady presence for each other, right? So by meeting every month and by studying the Kyriai Doxai and practicing Kyriai Doxai together, we become like a steady presence for each other, and we give each other feedback, and we give each other, we help each other to become experts in the study and the practice of Kyriai Doxai. So over the years, there's been very obvious benefits from that. I think we also contribute to each other's happiness also by the advice that we give each other when we have these discussions about the things that make life worth living. The whole point of ACAS is to continue the conversations that started with Epicurus and Metrodorus and their circle of friends. So we have a educational program or a short lecture that's involved in each ACAS to make sure that the discussion is rooted in our tradition and in philosophy. And as far as like how we are structured, we're not structured there's not a whole lot of structure because we're very egalitarian. For instance, in antiquity, the Epicureans used to have kategemones, which is the Epicurean guides. We don't have that in our circle, but I know that in Greece they have recognized kategemones in their communities. But in our community, everyone is just friends. That's the only hierarchical status that we have. So we're all trying to be friends to each other, and we're just really trying to make sure that all of our friends become experts in the practice of Kyriai Doxai. So it's more about practicing according to the practice of friendship and practicing ACAS. And we use anchors, what I like to think of as anchors, to give stability to each other's practice. Because there's so many distractions, so many other philosophies out there, so many digital distractions today, so that if you really want to have a stable identity as an Epicurean and stable communities and stable practice, it's good to have something that serves as a stabilizing force. So one of the things that we do, obviously, Kyriai Doxai, in the Society of Friends of Epicurus, we treat Kyriai Doxai, the principal doctrines, as a type of social contract. And that's probably our main anchor. The other one is obviously the ACAS celebration every month, where we become a community for each other. And I would argue that every friend that you have that is knowledgeable and that contributes to your knowledge and growth as an Epicurean is also a type of anchor that stabilizes your practice. So by the use of these anchors, we've been able to create a more or less stable virtual community, even though we haven't been able. I've met with Alan. He came to Chicago once. We had an in-person ACAS once. But for most of what we do, we're really a virtual community, and I think we function quite well with this, more or less informal model.
Thanks, Alan or Marcus. Do you have anything to add?
I just want to add to that. Very practical comment. It's just you don't have to be an Epicurean to participate in ICAS. If you just have to be interested in Epicureanism. So if you're a Stoic and you want to take part in ICAS, you're more than welcome. You can do that by joining the Garden of Epicurus Facebook group. It's a private group, so as you you can sign up. You'll probably get let in, no problem, and you can RSVP for any of our events. Just wanted to add that.
Yes, and that's a group on Facebook.
You answered one of my 2 follow-up questions, which was whether people can dip their toes into it, like for meditation centers. Sometimes they have open houses, or you can take a beginner's course, but you've sort of answered that question for me, I think. The second follow-up question I had concerning that, is there a single go-to list of existing Epicurean groups where somebody can kind of go? I co-founded the Stoic Fellowship in order to create essentially such a list where somebody could go to our map and find the closest Stoic group. Is there such a thing for Epicureanism? If so, where you could find it? If not, is there one in the works?
The closest thing to that, if you go to Society of Friends of Epicurus, societyofepicurus.com, let me go there actually to make sure that I'm giving you sending you to the correct place. There's a links. There's a Meet the Epicureans tab, which is more about individuals. But if you click on links, you will see a bunch of links. There's a group in Italy that has started to have every other year gatherings. There's the Greek page, which is really for Greek speakers. There's the Sydney group. So most of what you'll find, most of the groups that I know of, they're all there in the links page, really, of the Society of Epicurus. And then if you join our group, on Garden of Epicurus, then you can sort of introduce yourself and say where you are. And we've been able to meet each other. For instance, Alan met one of our other members who's in New Jersey at one point for dinner somewhere. So those kinds of gatherings can happen informally.
Cool.
I don't believe that there is a comprehensive list.
Yeah, personally, I'm very hard.
But we're sort of scattered, and we're disparate and few in number, really. So really there has not been enough momentum as of yet to get to the stage where we're having regular in-person meetings with high attendance. So we're not quite at that stage yet. But as Hiram mentioned earlier, there's functionally 2 groups of Epicureans operating in North America. And they both started virtually online. And I think slowly we're making progress towards a physical component of that Epicurean community. But the 2 are the Society of Friends of Epicurus, founded by Hiram, and the Epicurean Friends Forum, founded by Cassius Amicus.
Excellent. Thank you for the tips. So the questions from the audience are piling in. I do have one more question before opening it, and then people can either get in line if they want to speak by raising their virtual hand in Zoom. Otherwise, you can just type your question in the chat and I'll get to them in the order that they were received. So my final question is a personal one that I've always been confused about concerning Epicureanism, and that is its relationship to sharp pains and chronic pains as well. So Epicurus famously was able to achieve this characteristic of static pleasure by recalling conversations with his friend on his deathbed while he was dying painfully. And that hasn't quite clicked or resonated with me at a level about how the Epicureans can actually handle physical pain. I dislocated my kneecap a while ago and was actually able to get carted off a dance floor laughing a little bit in part because during that process I was able to separate physical pain from the mental sharpness of the pain using mindfulness and Buddhist techniques. I was mildly surprised about that. And I've used some related Stoic techniques for milder pain since with mixed success. But I can't simulate in my mind how was Epicurus happy in a eudaimonic sense when he was undergoing such physical pain. And so it's hard to use words because words kind of fail when we can't point to something in the external world. But I was wondering if you could kind of paint a picture of what Epicurus's happiness was like when you achieve mental static pleasure, even when physical pain is present. How does that work phenomenologically?
Okay. So I have 2 main things to say to that. The first one is that in the Vatican sayings, there's one Vatican saying that says that when you practice philosophy with our practice, there's the two main pleasures that we get from this practice is the wisdom and the friendship, right? So these are simultaneous with the practice of philosophy. But one of the things that I've noticed, like over the years, especially now that I've been practicing and teaching for 10 years, is that in the earlier stages, the learning is more prevalent because everything's new, right? So in the later stages, the friendship becomes more prevalent. And that's why Epicurus talked about getting old, growing old with his friends in philosophy. And I think this is because you've been able to build memories and to do things, have projects together with your friends. So over the years, when you look back, then you can be grateful for their loyalty, and you can have memories with them. So I think both pleasures are there, but I think the learning is more prevalent earlier, and the friendship is more prevalent later in his later years. And Epicurus, when he was in his deathbed, he was thinking about his friends. He wasn't thinking about the wisdom that he learned. He was thinking about the conversations with his friends. So the first part of that answer is that this is rather than a rational, the idea of reminiscing, rather than rational, it's relational. That's the pleasure that you're getting when you're thinking of your friends and thinking of the comfort. So think about it, like when you get very sick, one of the things that you need the comfort of people who are loved, of your loved ones, right? That's what you really crave for, right? More than the rational things that philosophy can give you. So I think that part of the pleasure that Epicurus was deriving in his deathbed was more relational. It was the comfort of having the friends that grew old with them in philosophy, who were always there all the way from his youth to his old age. So that's the first thing. The other thing is the laughter practice. One of the, I think, pieces of research that I mentioned in my book has to do with cancer patients who engage in a laughter practice. If you go on YouTube, you'll see a bunch of videos of what this looks like, and it looks kind of silly. But according to the research, it actually does work. It may not cure your cancer, I don't know, but it does cure the emotional and just the mental anguish and tiredness of just being chronically sick in this way. So we know from studies that laughter therapy does work, and we also know from our sources that Vatican Saint 41, laughter, this is the only philosophy that will give you the commandment that you must laugh, right? That this is part of the practice. This is a layer of the practice. And I think it has to do with the fact that laughter is a sign by which if I'm an Epicurean guy, and Epicurus says that with the practice of philosophy, the pleasure and the activity happen at the same time. So if I'm your teacher, then I want to see pleasure. And the easiest sign of pleasure in your body is laughter, because that's just pleasure bubbling up in your belly and in your lungs, in your body. So it's a way to make sure that the practitioner is practicing correctly, and it's also therapeutic, and it's also a sign that you're advancing in some way, and also a sign of overcoming, I think, because when I think of laughter, I think of you only laugh with or laugh at things that are not menacing in any way, that you feel confident with. So I think the laughter practice is probably a big part of what was happening when they were reminiscing about old memories, or when they were trying to apply the logic of Principle Doctrine 20, which is a logic where the mind is stronger than the flesh, right? So they would take refuge, again, like I said earlier, in these anchors, in these things that they trusted would provide some kind of pleasure in the midst of pain. So those are the two things that come to mind for me. I don't know if Alan and Marcus have other things to say.
I guess I'll go. Okay, so I'll second what Hiram says regarding friendship. I've actually been in situations where I was extremely sick physically, hospitalization, surgery, and all of that. Luckily, I made it out alive, but I was very fortunate to have some really dedicated friends, and my parents were there, of course, and my family. So having people around you who are supporting you is definitely something that will boost your well-being. The other thing is, one thing that's important about Epicurean conception of pleasure is our relationship to time, or mind's relationship to time. Unlike what is often supposed, Epicureanism is not just about like the present currently available pleasures. It's also, the pleasures of the past and the future. So if you're in a lot of pain, you have to go through a bad moment. It's pain, there's nothing else to say about it. It's bad, but it's not going to last. I mean, worst case scenario, it's going to kill you. And, we're not afraid of death. The other thing is, if you're an Epicurean sage, you already feel like your life is complete. I think the Epicureans and the Stoics are in agreement here. You're kind of ready. You're ready to die at any time. Now, I'm not saying that any of us have actually achieved that, pursued sagehood, but it's kind of an ideal we strive for. And I think over the years, we kind of become better at it and become more satisfied with our lives. So when bad things happen to you, you're more willing to accept it. But, back to the relationship about time, just the fact that, sometimes your mind finds ways to distract itself when you're in pain. I unfortunately have to deal with migraines quite often. I'm sure statistically some of your audience knows what that's like. And unfortunately, sometimes you just have to wait it out, and that can last days sometimes. So your mind just goes places you wouldn't expect it to go. Personally, I've just listened to podcasts sometimes, even though I'm in excruciating pain. And I don't know how much it does about the pain, but time does go by, and I feel a little more intelligent because I've listened to something educational. That's just me, but I'm sure we all come up with our own personal techniques to deal with these kinds of situations.
Thanks, Marcus. Alan, do you have anything to add?
Well, I think what my friend said is good. It's sufficient for an answer for now.
Okay, sounds good. So it sounds like kind of the general picture of the pain still sucks, but it's okay anyway. Is that an accurate way of describing in a short way, what you've said?
Yes, philosophy does not diminish or change nature, but it can help you to cope and deal with whatever difficulties you find in nature. So yeah, that is correct.
Yeah, I'm not aware of there being anything like a Buddhist meditation technique. I think that's might have been the sense of your original question. That helped you. By the way, I mean, Epicureans are not against adopting techniques from other traditions. There's nothing, so long as it doesn't conflict with our own values. And we can borrow from the Stoics, from the Buddhists. That has happened in the past, of course. Seneca famously quotes Epicurus quite often. Or Epicureans borrow from the Stoics as well, Philodemus, for example. So that's, Buddhist meditation. If it works, then we're all for it, of course. The other thing I'd say is that this is one of those areas where, unfortunately, the sources regarding this issue are very scarce. As we know, a lot of the writings have been lost, and sometimes they'll have papyrus fragments from an Epicurean writer that start delving in some subject, and then the papyrus breaks off, and you're just kind of left frustrated that you didn't see the rest of it. But it's true that of the four the Tetrapharmacus, the four cures, don't fear the gods, don't fear death, what is good can be attained, and suffering can be withstood. The fourth one is the one where there's the least amount of surviving sources. So we try to make something with what we have, and then we can fill in the rest with our own experience or what we learn from other traditions.
Cool. Thank you. So I have plenty more questions. I sent them to Hiram ahead of time, but I want to give the participants who took the time to show up the opportunity to ask their own questions. So I see one person has their hand raised, and I have a queue of 3 to read. So I'm going to start reading the 3, then turn it over to the hand raising queue as well as whatever else is going on. So the first question is a fairly obscure one, and so you may want to fire up the letter to Herodotus if you want to answer this question, just to give you a heads up, because I'm actually not exactly sure what the passage is either, but this comes from Mike S. And he asks, in stanza 70 of the letter to Herodotus, it mentions quote unquote accidents. I can't make sense what they're trying to say. Is it like a rope looking at a snake, or possibly an aardvark like an anteater? Or is it a lost in translation because the lost commentaries and works of the commentaries and a lot of the works of Epicurus are lost? So can you tell us a little bit more about stanza 70 of the letter to Herodotus and what they're trying to mean by accidents there?
Hold on, I'm reading accidents of the body do not of necessity make any part of its nature cannot be considered independent substances. So I know what they're talking about here. There's two properties of bodies. So the letter to Herodotus is a fascinating document where it gives you a window into the conversations that the very first atomists 2,300 years ago had, by which they developed their atomic theory in its ancient form. And it's very interesting to read because it's the birth of the modern scientific worldview. You're seeing it right in those conversations. And Epicurus and within the atomist tradition, we do not accept supernatural claims. So everything is explained in terms of particles and of bodies. And there's a paradigm of emergence where the more particles you have, the more bodies, the more particles you have in a body, then the more those particles will interact with each other. And that's where complexity comes from. So one of the things that the ancient atomists were clear about is that there are two different properties of particles and of bodies. There's the inherent properties, which are inherent to the particular body, which will always be there whenever a particular set of properties exist there. For instance, the behavior of water, we always know that water behaves a certain way. There's certain metals that have electric conductivity and so on. So that's inherent. But then there's relational properties, which are here called accidents. And some translations use other terms, but in our third scholar used the word accidental properties or relational properties. And the idea is that Epicurus was opening, he began, I guess, thinking of the nature of things in terms of chemistry and how two bodies, when they come together, they generate something more complex than their inherent properties. So all of a sudden you have new properties like a magnet. You have properties that allow one stone to attract another stone in the case of a magnet. That's a relational property. So the Epicureans observed that as bodies gained more complexity and more particles, that the relational properties or accidents that happened between them were of a certain amount of complexity that didn't exist before when they were simpler. And the argument that the Epicureans were making is that these relational properties are just as real as the inherent or innate properties of the bodies, that they're no less real just because they're relational. So that's the gist of that discussion there.
Cool. Thanks for the clarity. Yeah. And it sounds like this is something that you could also extend. You had a chapter in Tending the Epicurean Garden going into the differences and similarities of modern physics as well as ancient Epicurean physics. This sounds like a kind of complexity theory or multi-body problem and how things get difficult, but you need to have two particles in relation to each other in order to start doing the physics. So cool.
I think the modern scientific term for that would be secondary qualities. I think that's basically the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's maybe a Lockean phrase. I'm not positive. I'm a little fuzzy on my history of scientific terms, but yeah, it could be. Cool. Thank you, Marcus, and thank you, Hiram. So I'm going to go on to the second question from Scott B. And quoting him, he says, if I understand correctly, ataraxia is the end goal for Epicureans, with ataraxia being steady state happiness and freedom from pain or mental anguish. It sounds great, but I spend a lot of time doing work that regularly disturbs my tranquility, leaving me upset for days sometimes, but which helps my fellow humans. Would an Epicurean do anything that benefits the common good at the cost of pain to the practitioner? Would they just do a utilitarian-style calculation of which course of action generates the most net pleasure? So, and this, so in short, like how do Epicureans, modern Epicureans who practice it, balance their pain versus the pleasure of many?
Well, that's called hedonic calculus. So, for instance, one of our founders, Metrodorus, he frequently referred to hedonic calculus. Hedonic calculus is really the answer to all of your ethical and moral issues and questions. And a lot of that has to do with your hierarchical conception of your values and the things that are important to you. But one of the things that Metrodorus says is that it's inevitable that you will make certain sacrifice for your friends and for the people that you care about and the people in your social contract. Because if you didn't have those friends in your life, then you would suffer from the absence of those friends, right? So for the sake of that, then you do accept some inconveniences, whether it's worrying about the safety of a person, whether it's just sacrifices that you take up to help that person in difficulty. Some people create more difficulty than others, but because you love them enough, usually. So a lot of that has to do with your level of affection and trust and I guess how much you rely on each other, and how deep inside your circles of trust they are. You're more willing to do more for a person that's in your inner circle than for a stranger, for example. But so that's something that you need to calculate on your own, depending on how much you care about that person. But we're all embedded in all kinds of social contracts, and we all have to go through inconveniences for the sake of other persons. And generally, so if you understand what your values are, then you do it gladly because you care about the person that you're trying to help, and you understand that this is a responsibility that you have acquired by being in the particular social contract that you're in. But you won't. I don't think you'll be able to evade social responsibility. I think that's part of being an adult and being a normal human being.
Yeah, I would say that, interestingly enough, there's a lot of debate among modern Epicureans about how to exactly interpret the concept of ataraxia. But also, even among ancient Epicureans, this question was debated amongst different Epicurean schools, and they often went back and forth with each other, just as with just as much passion as there would be a debate between Epicureans and Stoics. So there wasn't exactly consensus around that. The other thing is that from the perspective of friendship, there's one approach that says that in the beginning, you begin to have a relationship with someone because there's some kind of utility. Maybe you have the same activity. Maybe you're both into bowling or something like that, or maybe you're colleagues at work. But then over time, you start appreciating the person for who they are, and not just for the activity or the benefit that you get for them. So you already have like two levels of friendship. The initial one, which is, you're dealing with a stranger, basically, you're getting to know them, and you're approaching them for such and such a reason. But then eventually, you're taking them to the hospital, and you're taking time off work or using your vacation time in order to look after them, and so on. And this could be elevated even further. I mean, even once your loved one, maybe they'll unfortunately pass away, you're still going to be thinking about them, and you're going to set time aside to remember them and honor them. So there are multiple layers by which you can approach a relationship to another person, and how much of yourself you're willing to put in there. The other thing is, I think the question also was in regards to how we deal with social responsibilities beyond just friends. So for the Epicureans, basically it's, I think, well, there's obviously the enlightened self-interest part of it, where, it makes sense to, do as much as possible to help people in need, for example, because one day you may be in that position and you want to live in a society where people in need are taken care of. Also, I mean, this is multifaceted. By doing that, for example, let's say I want to volunteer for a homeless shelter or something like that. On the one hand, it's my social responsibility. It's a virtue, arete, as the Greeks would say, to do that. But then on top of that, maybe that's also a way where you meet people and you make new friends. So this is, there's a lot of indirect ways in which we benefit from these kinds of things.
Ellen, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so the question stated that the person does work that regularly disturbs their tranquility, leaving them upset. I think we can ascertain from the historical sources that the advanced Epicurean practitioner will not be completely impervious to feelings of emotional distress or to certain emotions, disturbing emotions like anger. As Marcus mentioned, historical sects within the Epicurean school had differing conceptions about the role of anger in Epicurean practice, and to what extent the emotion can be accepted or rejected. acknowledged and acted upon. We also have that the Epicurean sage would be more emotional, but that their propensity to experience emotion will not hinder their wisdom. And going back to the issue of anger, there seems to be a distinction between two kinds of anger: natural kinds of anger and a rage. And it seems that the sources suggest that the Epicurean sage would tend to experience the natural kind of anger in response to seeing things that are harmful or painful to other persons. And in those cases, it's natural to pause, reflect, and think about what course of action you can take to alleviate the suffering of other people, and to put an end to the anger. Put an end to the harming, I mean, and using your anger to promote like some sort of correction course to whatever harm that you just witnessed. So that's what I can say about that for now.
Thanks. I have a mild, it's probably a moderate follow-up question, and then I'm going to turn to another question from Patricia in the chat before going on to the hand-raised queue for some back and forth Q&A. But I'm curious, as a modern Epicurean, so then you see some harm in the world, and I presume I think one of the main criteria for being involved in politics in ancient Epicureanism was if the garden is under threat, if there's something like that so big of a deal that you need to get involved. I'm curious to all three of you, is there anything you see in the modern world that's kind of like that and that has motivated you to some sort of political action? And if so, what? And how was your calculus, hedonic calculus, involved in considering whether to act or not?
Well, I think one thing that I think anyone who is philosophically minded should agree on this. And this is one thing where I think we all need to come together on this issue, or we're not decent philosophers. And that is freedom of expression. Freedom of opinion. That's something that, I think that pretty much across the board, we want to debate each other. Also, regarding the ancient Epicureans, regarding their participation in politics, it's a little more complex than that. I mean, it used to be believed that the Epicureans were hardcore, we don't get involved in politics, because there were scholars had access to limited sources. But over the last century, there is this basically this ancient library in the city of Herculaneum that was discovered. It was destroyed by the same eruption that destroyed Pompeii. But ironically, the content of the library, the scrolls, were preserved because they were carbonized by the heat. And honestly, it's been kind of a whole process to try to decipher these scrolls without destroying them. They're very fragmentary, but over the decades, the scholars have made quite a lot of advances thanks to technology. So we know a lot more now. And one thing we realize is that the Epicureans were much more open to getting involved in politics than originally thought. There's a treatise by the philosopher Philodemus, for example, called On the Good King According to Homer, where he gives counsel to rulers. There is this other philosopher by the name of Philonides, who was an advisor to the king of the Seleucid Empire. So there was a lot more going on there. And basically the criteria for getting involved in politics could either be like you don't really have much of a choice. Let's say you're born into a senatorial family in Rome and it's part of the family duty to be in a high position, then the Epicureans would advise to go along with your duties, and we'll try to make this as fruitful as possible. The other thing is Epicureans recognize that we all have different personalities, and there are some people who will be personally inclined to follow that path. That's not going to be most people, but in some cases they'll say, you know what, you'll probably have more anxiety and suffering if you don't pursue your inclination than if you do. So if you follow your inclinations to become, look for power, then you'll inevitably get frustrated and you'll go through suffering. But if you don't, you'll regret the rest of your life not having tried it. So there's the hedonic calculus in action. Anyway, this is a very complex topic and it's still debated among scholars, but I just wanted to point out that this is a very tricky issue.
Helen or Hiram, do you have anything to add to that follow-up question? Oh, you need to be unmuted. Sorry. So let's see. There we go.
I had an ambulance, so that's why I didn't want all that noise to interfere. But concerning, I think the question was concerning how, to the extent to which politics passes hedonic calculus, and that's very individual, like it was already said before. But I want to use one case study, which is Thomas Jefferson, who called himself an Epicurean in his letter to William Short. And also, Thomas Jefferson was in a very particular place in history because he was a child of the Enlightenment. He had lived in France, so he received all the benefit from the French Enlightenment that he was immersed in. And he was in the unique place in history where he could help to write the social contract of the United States of America, which was a country that was born by his pen to some extent: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. So I've always imagined like the Force ghost of the Jedi Force ghost of Epicurus hovering over him when he wrote those words. But this is a very, very pivotal moment in history. And he was very privileged to be in that position, right? So, and he was also practicing the Kyriai Doxai. He was practicing the Doxai concerning natural justice and finding what is advantageous for mutual association, which is the term that Epicurus uses in Kyriai Doxai. For natural justice. So he had the opportunity to create a social contract for a country that was being born, that was influenced by the ideas of the French Enlightenment, which also influenced the French Revolution at around that same time. And he was in that unique position that he could create maybe not an Epicurean society, but a society where if you had Epicurean convictions, you could thrive. You know, a society of free speech, you know, all these other guarantees. So, so that's the perfect example of why, of the ways in which politics and involvement in politics can pass hedonic calculus, just by the urgency of that moment in history, maybe, or by whatever skill set you have that you feel like you can contribute to the society that you're involved in. So that's just the one case study that I want to bring up.
Cool, thank you. I'm going to move on to Patricia's question, which is also somewhat related to this idea of the hedonic calculus and how an Epicurean would actually use it in practice. Part of this is answered before, but Patricia brings up a very interesting specific example that perhaps you can walk through. So I'll read her question in full. So she says, she asks if the three speakers can talk about the way you balance the hedonic calculus and the social contract between friends. On the one hand, you have your moral commitment to avoid pain, and on the other, an obligation to support a friend. How would you personally calculate what to do in the following situation? A friend is ill with dementia. She says unkind things and is critical of all you do. You find being with her emotionally draining and certainly a large pain. Can any of you talk through your hedonic calculus and show your work in terms of what you would do in this particular situation?
I'm just going to say that's a very good question.
Yeah, I have no experience working with or living with people with dementia, and what I've seen, because I have an aunt that's suffering with that, is that it's very, very, very tiresome. So I don't think that I would have personally the skill set to help a person with dementia very much. So I think I would probably find someone that has the skill set and the background to be that presence for that person in that circumstance. Whether it's someone in my family or someone who's like a nurse or someone with a professional background to do it. Personally, that's probably what I would do, because I don't know that I have the skill set to help someone with dementia. From what I've seen, it just seems like a very draining thing. And because I have the other responsibilities and things in my life, I'm not sure that I would be the correct person But that would be, if it was someone very close to me, it would be a very difficult maybe decision to make.
Thank you. Alan, do you have any thoughts on the matter? And again, no is perfectly fine if you don't.
The question is, it's a good challenge. I think it would benefit if there was a little bit more clarity on the depth of the relationship between myself and the other person. She said that we are friends, but like, how deep is our friendship? How long is our relationship? How intimate? I think there is clear evidence from our textual sources that and Epicureans will go to great lengths for the benefit of their friends, even at the expense of well, their own time, resources, and well-being even. And even in some cases, an Epicurean might lay down their life to save their friend in a situation where that is necessary. So that is certainly certainly a situation that would have to be more carefully considered, and the context would have to be more elaborated. But I think ultimately it would be an individual decision on the part of the practitioner, what lengths they would go to, I don't know, what the goal is, to preserve the relationship with a friend or to attempt to assist their friend. So it's not ultimately clear what the end goal is, what we're supposed to achieve with that. Sorry about that.
Yeah, and this also adds the interesting element of the fact that the friend is, in a sense, decaying because they are disappearing as the person who you knew. That's one of the qualities of dementia. It's different from cancer or some other a terminal infection or something where they're still there, though perhaps a bit feverish or in pain, but still there. Dementia is an interesting and different example.
So the only thing I would have to add to this, because, you know, like Alan and Hiram, I don't have that much experience. I've only seen it from far away. Honestly, it's pretty brutal to see that happen. Like someone's mind little by little rot away. I mean, that's I hope that, you know, I don't wish that on anyone. But I'll say this is that we're kind of disadvantaged from living in individualistic societies in this case. I think back in the, you know, even traditional societies today, but back in the days of the Epicurean gardens in ancient Greece, these were whole communities. And you probably wouldn't have been alone dealing with the person who is suffering from that condition. There would have been a whole community behind you. So I think, you know, nowadays in those type of situations, it's probably a lot more difficult. Though we do have the advantage of understanding the science of it further. You know, at least we're not going to think that they're being possessed by a demon or something like that. So I think, you know, and hopefully, you know, this is one of those things where I hope science makes some huge progress. And maybe that's one reason to get engaged politically, to have more investment in this kind of research. So that's one area where I could see the enlightened self-interest of getting involved in politics.
Cool. Thank you, Marcus. So we have only one question in the queue, and that is a hand raised from Joseph Bullock. So I'm going to ask him to unmute. And while I do that, I'll invite people to also ask further questions in the chat. We still have about 5-10 minutes of official time. And if everybody is game, we can go over if there are more questions. Otherwise, we'll cut it there with Joseph's question. But in the interim, feel free to put a question in the chat or raise your virtual hand in Zoom, and I will call on you. So with that, it looks like Joseph is unmuted. So feel free to ask your question, Joseph.
Thanks, Greg, for setting this up, and thank you, everyone, for joining us. I just have a pretty simple question. I was actually in a conversation last night about the philosophy of humor, actually, and you mentioned laughter as a way of coping with pain. And one of the things that we discussed was obviously the superiority complex and, you know, the ethics that go along with that. What does Epicurus say about humor, in the sense that it does, if you're laughing at something, and that could actually be at the expense of another individual, and how does that actually relate to the idea of friendship within that as well, because I often feel like you can laugh with friends, but who are you laughing at? And then, so it's an important component of friendship, and I know that how important friendship is in Epicureanism. So I haven't read anything that specifically talks about humor and Epicureanism, and I was wondering if you could expand on that.
Yeah, there's two essays that I can probably post them in our chat. I wrote an essay many years ago about for a classics publication on the role of comedy as a tool in the culture wars, because our modern culture wars are not new. This is something that's been going on for thousands of years. There's been in antiquity, it was really a battle between the people who believed in the physics and the people who believed in creationism or in supernatural claims. And in Lucretius, you see that cultural war being fought. You also see it in Lucian. I wrote an essay titled Pastafarians, something about the Pastafarians, where I was looking at the role that comedy plays in satire plays in modern atheistic activism, particularly with parody religions like Pastafarianism, versus what Lucian, a second century comedian, was doing in the second century, where he mocked a false prophet. And more recently, I wrote an essay on Lucian himself and his friendship with Celsus, where he dedicates the work Alexander the Oracle Monger to his friend Celsus. So they're mocking a false prophet. So there's an outside person who's hostile to Epicureans, and this is all depicted in the novel, in the storyline of Alexander the Oracle Monger, and he's seen as a charlatan. And for many years, Celsus and Lucian, who was a second century comedian, they were just cracking jokes about this character. And when Lucian tried to expose this character, his life was in danger, and he explains this towards the end of the novel. So this is basically the novel is like the Religulus of the second century, right? It's a parody, a satire of conventional religion. So the Epicureans were getting together to mock the superstitions of common folk, and this goes back all the way to Democritus, the inventor of atomism, because when you have a natural understanding of the nature of things, then the silly beliefs of the majority of the superstitions, the common superstitions, then they're funny. So there was a culture of comedy that had to do with the defense of scientific values in antiquity, and this was very much part of the culture, and we see it in Lucian most vividly. So if you go to the Society of Friends of Epicurus, and I'm going to share the link in a little bit, you will find that one of my last essays was on Lucian. And so the role that comedy plays there is very prominent. And one of the things about that, the Lucian case study specifically, is that Lucian wrote this novel as an act of solidarity with other Epicureans, because he mentions that there were Epicureans in the audience that were being attacked by this false prophet. So having an enemy that you're mocking creates a sense of us versus them, and it creates, like I said earlier, a clique, and a sense of like our friendship is based on these experiences of laughing at the silly things that are happening in our culture, right? So the role of laughter here is that it helps to strengthen the sense of community and the sense of culture. There's a culture of satire, the culture of comedy that became part of what they did when they got together. This is a full novel, Alexander the Oracle Monger. So it's really, he gathered all these jokes that he had been telling his friends. Lucian was a great narrator. He probably spent years visiting this community or with Celsus, laughing at these jokes. And they just gathered these stories, and the gathering of the stories itself is an act of friendship, because this was done to honor his friend Celsus, who asked him specifically to gather these jokes together so that they can keep laughing at it with their friends in that community. So the role of laughter is to lubricate communities, I think, to lubricate like the sense of joy and companionship and friendship that we have with each other by laughing at things that are happening outside of the culture that we consider silly. I'm going to look up the links, and I'm going to share them in the chat.
Thanks.
I think the question was about what is the role of humor between friends in scenarios where somebody might be deriving humor at the expense of another person. I think that was mentioned. Well, one of the foundations of Epicurean friendship is justice, which Principle Doctrine 31 states is a compact between people to neither harm nor be harmed. So any sort of deriving humor at the expense of another person in the case of friends is going to be looked down upon, and there are ways to restore what has been wronged. There are practices to make amends for wrongs that have been committed in the Epicurean community between Epicurean friends. And that's a deeper subject, and we could talk about that for a long time, but I just wanted to mention that that exists. But there's also the deeper question, moving away from just humor itself. Humor is one manifestation of joy, but what about any kind of pleasure, any kind of derivation of pleasure at the expense of other people? And we have in On the Nature of Things by Lucretius a short episode where Lucretius regards the wise philosopher contemplating their position, looking down upon a battlefield where there are two factions engaged in a pitched battle. So basically a scene of warfare, and Lucretius is imagining this philosopher high in the tower, separate from this event taking place, but being able to witness it and deriving pleasure from their acknowledgement of their own lack of how to say it, like not being involved in that situation, pretty much. And that passage in On the Nature of Things has been taken to be an example of a sort of Schadenfreude in Epicureanism, but I think that that's actually a shallow reading. That's a shallow reading of that, and it's not quite correct to say. And in fact, Lucretius even immediately rebuts that within pretty much the same passage. That take of his words. He says that the pleasure is not being derived from the fact that other people are being harmed. It's just that you're confident in the security that you have provided for yourself through your practice of philosophy, and that you're grateful, basically, that you are not subject to the harms that other people who are still meandering in their ways of life are subject to.
So, but there's also examples of Epicurus himself, although we may take the quotes with a grain of salt, mocking other philosophers, like calling Plato the Golden, to mock his ranking of people within the Callipolis. So what's your take on that? And also, so mocking within the community, except if it's in a clear, friendly way, may be frowned upon. But Epicureans also have this kind of like, we are, at least my understanding of it is that it's kind of like you have the community and the outside. And there does have to be a pact between communities and the outside because of the social contract theory of justice that Epicurus put forward, that laws, like people should just agree not to harm one another no matter where they lie within society. But what about mocking outsiders? Is there a role for that or not?
Yeah, about those quotes, I mean, unfortunately, we don't know how much of what the context was, or even if they were real. Apparently, there was one rival philosophy that purposely wrote letters claiming to be Epicurus, but it wasn't really him. So we don't have the whole context behind that. Don't get me wrong. I'm pretty sure like the Epicureans were human beings, and they had, like everyone else, they had their flaws, I'm sure. That's all just that's pretty much what I would conclude about that. Regarding outsiders, there was one quote from Philodemus where he talks about well-meaning outsiders or well-disposed outsiders that are welcome to join the Epicureans during their Icus feasts. So there was a certain amount of interaction, even fraternizing. Cicero famously, who was an anti-Epicurean, was his best friend was Atticus, who was an Epicurean. So you have interactions with outsiders. So it's not like they were isolated in their garden and not dealing with the outside world. But of course, the garden is also supposed to be kind of a place where you feel safe. It provides a sense of security among the close friends. So I'm sure there are different layers of interactions with people. Regarding the question of laughter, that tradition actually started with Democritus. Famously, he's known as the laughing philosopher, and Epicurus, he inherited a lot of what Democritus preached. Then you have, in terms of mockery, there's one passage in a fragment from Herculaneum that's from Epicurus's On Nature, where he's kind of mocking himself, like he's concluding the chapter in his treatise by saying, well, that's enough with my boring lectures. Let's move on. Kind of like kind of sensing that his audience was bored with what he was saying. Also, there's the technique of the diatribe, which actually came from the Cynics and the Stoics. And Philodemus actually borrows that technique in his treatise on anger. Not all Epicureans agreed with that, by the way. There was some internal debate about, if we should borrow that technique or not. But you see that in Philodemus. You see that in Lucretius as well. Usually it's used to sort of mock, people who give into vices. So, people who are excessively angry, or people who are crazy in love and they're behaving ridiculous, and they're basically using that for educational purposes, or basically it's, you kind of want to show what it's like to be in that psychological state, to show how ridiculous you look to outsiders. It's kind of like a cautionary tale, like you don't want to be like this person. So there's a pedagogical thing going on there. Yeah, other than that, I don't know if you have anything else to add, Hiram, Alan.
Yes, it's difficult to know to what extent this mockery was mutual, because we know many people were very against Epicurean philosophy. Timocrates, the brother of Metrodorus, turned away from the Epicurean garden. I think that one of the things about paresia, if you study the practice of paresia,
frank speech, by the way,
frankness. The practice of frankness is necessary for your moral development. So if I'm invested in your moral development, I'm going to give you criticism. Otherwise, I'm just a flatterer, and that's a definition of a false friend. So, and one of the techniques that is used for giving paresia to your friends is laughter, because it softens maybe the blow. But this requires trust. And the thing about paresia is that paresia works effectively when it's between people that trust each other. So if I know that you have goodwill and that you're mocking me because you want me to have some process of moral development, or to turn away or be embarrassed about something that I did that you don't want me to do again, then if I trust that you have that investment in my character, then I will laugh at myself at my own expense and benefit from your frank criticism. If I don't benefit from your frank criticism, then the friendship is probably not a real friendship, because then you're expecting me to be a flatterer. So there's a lot of tension like this that happened in the circle of Philodemus when he was writing these scrolls, that he talks about, how uncomfortable it is to give frank criticism to people who are very old, or to women, or to people of different dispositions that just don't like being criticized. So this is one of the inherently uncomfortable things about the way that we practice philosophy, is that some people just really don't survive the process of paresia and frank criticism, and because they just don't know how to benefit from it, and so they turn away. And so for an Epicurean friendship to last over the long term, it requires that level of trust and goodwill to benefit from each other's paresia. And also, I also want to argue that laughing at yourself and laughing at others, is a healthier way of dealing with a healthier disposition for dealing with dysfunctional relations or with many other moral problems than bitterness or politics. People can become very embittered, whereas laughter allows you to deal with whatever difficulty you're dealing with in a manner that is, I think, healthier. I think it's healthy to laugh at ourselves, and I think it's healthy to laugh at life, and just to laugh. It's just a healthy practice. So there's many gray areas, and there's many things that need to be negotiated between friends. But typically, if your friend is true, and if you trust your friend, and if you have goodwill with your friend, then you know that your friend is not trying to humiliate you. Epicurians were never known for humiliating their close friends. That we weren't like Socrates. It was a very different situation. So yeah.
This is actually, that's a really good point. And this is one of those areas where human relationships are just messy. And you see that in Philodemus's treatise on frank criticism, where he's talking about how different types of people with different personalities and different backgrounds are going to be open to certain types of criticism. Like some people, they want you to tell it to them straight. They don't like sugarcoating, they just want you to be blunt. Where other people, you have to really be cautious about how you talk to them. And people are so different from one another. You can be the wisest of all philosophers. Eventually, you're going to get it wrong and you're going to say something hurtful, even if it's not intentional. So yeah, unfortunately, that's part of human nature. And all we can do is our best.
Those are good words, I think, to end on since we are short on time. I will invite people in the audience to type out or raise their hands if they have any last questions. But in the interim, I just wanted to open the floor to Hiram, Alan, and Marcus to see if there's anything that you missed and that you want to say, as well as just remind the audience of where people can find out more about the Society of Friends of Epicurus and your favorite sources for Epicureanism in general, if you'd like. Since the chat may not be recorded, feel free to put information in the chat so people can click on it, but also just say it out loud so people who watch the video later can find y'all.
We'll say facebook.com/groups/Epicurean Garden is where we're mostly active. And it's just, if you look it up under Garden of Epicurus, the Garden of Epicurus group on Facebook, that's where you'll find us. And from there, if you are a member of the garden, then you will get the invite every month to participate in ACAS. So that's where we have do a little toast in memory of Epicurus and Metrodorus. And after some informal discussion, we have usually a short lecture, 30, 45 minutes, and then informal discussion about that lecture. And that's our monthly virtual ACAS program. So I would say that's the main place where you can, if you want to delve into the type of things that we do and into our practice of Kyriai Doxai together, Garden of Epicurus group on Facebook. You can also follow us on Twitter if you look up Society of Epicurus. And if you just want to consume essays and learn about some of the content that we've created, you can also go to the Epicurus page, just plain Epicurus, or Society of Epicurus, which is another page on Facebook. So that's mainly where we are, plus societyofepicurus.com.
Excellent. Well, with that, we will wrap things up. I want to thank you, Marcus, Alan, and Hiram, for coming to New York City Stoics and letting us learn a little bit more about other practical philosophies and how they're being brought into the world. Stoicism's in a lot of people's minds, and that's partially through luck. And Stoics don't like moral things being up to luck. So part of my goal over the course of this year in New York City Stoics is to bring other options to people. So again, thank you for your time. And yeah, take care.
All right.
Thank you for having us.